I want to make a video on a very, very specific point. How specific we remains to be seen. I grabbed, sometimes books catch my eye and I'll grab them and I'll say, Lord, why'd you want me to look at this? And I flip through them and there's always something. This duct tape bound, these are the scriptures I used when I was a missionary in Chile for the LDS church. Well, that's not a correct way to say it. I was a missionary for God and I just happened to be in the LDS church at the time. There's a lot of things I would do differently if I repeated that, but I think if you get through your life without being able to say that about just about everything you've ever done, you're probably doing something wrong. Anyway, this is a well-worn copy, and just flipping through it gives me a lot of satisfaction over how I spent that time. Again, not that I wouldn't do things differently, but I think one of the things that's going to give us the greatest amount of joy in the eternities is anything we put our whole soul into that happened to be very difficult. And the interesting thing about that is pretty much anything can be very difficult if you put your whole soul into it, especially because this world is designed to provide resistance. And it's like the harder you try and the better the things you're doing, the more resistance there will be by design. And thank God for that. That's interesting. This thing's marked to pieces. I've got little notes tucked in here, and it's covered with duct tape because I just kept thinking as I was walking the streets that as a soldier, you don't put your rifle away, you have it ready because you never know when you need to shoot somebody. And I figured I better have this out, and it got pretty worn, so I covered it with duct tape. But I wrote topics on the side, and they're in Spanish, but I marked up scriptures and color-coded it with these tabs because I've always been terrible at memorizing things. And with a lot of language, you need specific words to carry the power. So the tabs connected, usually color-coded dots with specific verses on whatever topic, and it helped me find things quickly. So I discovered that you have about 7 seconds before someone makes up their minds. It's funny, this pattern's repeated on YouTube. You can watch the drop-off. YouTube's got all these statistics that I really don't care about, but sometimes when I'm trying to do my job at answering sincere comments, you have to cruise through these things, and they'll tell you what points in videos people stop watching and everything, and I have yet to click on the video to see what I said that caused people to leave, but it's about the same. You have 7 seconds to hook someone. I think face-to-face people will stay if they stay for 7 seconds, but if you know, there's a continuous drop-off in video because this is perceived to be extremely low commitment. And I made a video the other day, it might have been yesterday, on why that's not the case. It's not low commitment because we're held accountable for what we have access to, whether we care or not. Anyway, this was what I was meant to see, and it's a quote, and it's in Spanish, and I've got it taped into the back cover. And I read it and I said, wow, that's a really good quote. And it's worn, it's like kind of dirty because I read it many, many times while I was out. It's kind of like this thing, which I just so happen to have laying on the bed because I don't know where to put it at the moment. This is my 3D to-do list in our guest room. I've got an obscenely large pile of notes that I have not yet processed, and having it over there helps me not think about it. But I've got this thing, which is a little ghetto laminated double-sided quote. On the one side, it has this from Matthew 22, "Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. And thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." And those are the two great commandments. And on the other side is D&C 93:1, and it says, every soul who forsaketh his sins and cometh unto me and calleth on my name and obeyeth my voice and keepeth my commandments shall see my face and know that I am. And in case it matters to you, that is a true promise. And I've known that since the first time I read it. Through faith, and now many times through experience. So, I'm no good at memorizing things, so I wrote this out, and it was in my wallet for many years. And then one day, the Lord said I don't have to carry it anymore because it's in here. Anyway, that's not the reason I'm making this video. So, this quote's in Spanish, and I took 5 minutes to try to find it in English, and I can't. If you can find it, please post it, and I'll pin it. Don't spend tons of time on it, but if you somehow have lots of Joseph F. Smith quotes memorized. So I'll translate it. It says, and forgive me if this is a rough translation, I'm quite out of practice. I used to be so fluent. When I was in Chile, my goal was to be so fluent that people couldn't tell that Spanish wasn't my first language. And the reason for that is I was always very frustrated when anything in me impeded the ability for the Spirit to use me to communicate to other people. So when God put something into my heart or mind, and some limitation in my vocabulary or pronunciation prevented me from communicating that effectively to the people I was there to benefit and serve, it frustrated me. And so I worked very hard. I had this ring. It was like this big. It was bigger than my head, and that's not easy. That I made out of a metal coat hanger. And on that ring, I had a bajillion tiny little cutouts from index cards, little pieces with a word and its definition. They were flashcards. And every single time during the day I heard a word that I didn't know, or I wanted to say something in English, the thought occurred and I didn't know the Spanish word. When we got back, I'd study it and look it up and add it to the card pile. And then I'd work over these cards every day. And once I had a word mastered, I'd put it on the ring, and then I'd have a short pile. And every once in a while, I'd go through the whole ring, and anything that wasn't second nature, I'd put into the short pile again. So I just worked at this. And I knew I had made it one day when someone said, "Where are you from? Because you sound Chilean, but you look Chinese." And I said, "I'm neither, and I'm offended by both." But anyway, so I'm not fluent anymore in Spanish. I just haven't had motivation or opportunity to practice, I guess. Anyway, so forgive me if the translation's rough. Man, sorry. It says, no person can obtain the gift of eternal life if he's not willing to sacrifice all earthly things to obtain it. We can't achieve this while our desires are focused on the world. If the Lord required me to give him everything that I possess, I hope I can do it with joy and a good attitude, or it might be grateful attitude. And he says, now, how many of us have the confidence in the Lord that Abraham had? suppose that the Lord asked of you your firstborn, or whatever other beloved thing, or your good, or your prized possessions. That's probably what that says in English. I can't think of this word not in Spanish. Would you go along with it without complaining? It doesn't quite say obey. Support. Would you support it without obeying? That's not quite right. Can we hope for celestial glory if there's some dark corner of our hearts that is still attached, some deep corner of our heart that's still attached to the world? Ask yourselves if you're worthy to receive if there is, ask yourself if you're worthy to receive exaltation in the celestial kingdom of God. I'm sorry, that was so rough. But you can probably guess why I like this quote so much, why I taped it in here, and I read it often, apparently, from the wear on this thing, the yellowing. Two things that I wanted to highlight from this. First off, this is a very valuable thing to think about and ask yourself. It's funny how cyclic so many things are in the gospel, and it's like this iterative revisiting all the time of the same ideas over and over and over again. But each time you go around the wheel, which I'm using that language intentionally because the ways of the Lord are one eternal round, a wheel that just keeps spinning. Each time you go around, though, you hit the same thing at a higher resolution if you're growing, and you learn more, and you see things more deeply, and it changes everything. And reading this today, I am sure that different things crossed my mind than they did in 2007. And deeper things and better things, more valuable things. And it's funny how many times the pattern is repeated in life where you come full circle and you see things for the first time. And it's funny because that repeats itself over and over again. You're just constantly being reborn in greater information, greater value, greater truth, greater righteousness, greater holiness, greater love, greater joy, and greater suffering, but for greater good. My sponsors pay me $5 every time I say greater. So the other thing that I wanted to highlight from this quote, though, is this idea. There's three things. I said there's two. I'm going to say three. Is this idea that, if you follow this channel, you know that I'm not LDS. I was excommunicated from the LDS church for writing a book that highlighted some things that some church leaders said and some traditions that some members believe very strongly in that contradict the teachings of Joseph Smith and they contradict the scriptures. There was a stake president who didn't like that very much, and the church leadership wrote rules into the handbook about that sort of thing. And so that was the pronounced result of all of that. But anyway, there are things that Joseph F. Smith did and taught that I think were absolutely not what he should have done or taught. And yet, this quote is fantastic. And if a person lived by what this said, I'm not sure how much more you would need to go by to be on a really good track. So, put another way, I think I struggle to believe that there are very many people who couldn't do more of what this says to do. All that being said, thing number 3 is it's so important to pay attention. Well, how can I phrase this? There are layers of extraction of value, information from words, from experiences, from people. And kind of the first pass is the low granularity, rough cut. And that's really valuable. So if you've ever weeded a garden and it's overgrown, the first time you hit it, you just kind of go nuts and you focus on volume, right? And then maybe the second time you go in, there are a couple of plants that weren't really easy to pull out. So you skipped over those after giving them a quick tug the first time through. So the second time through, you get ready for the digging expedition. Maybe you have a pickaxe, or you've brought some friends or some kids, do some forced labor, get those things out that are really tough. And then maybe the third time you go back, and some of the plants you tore out have regrown from the roots that got left behind and you couldn't tell. So now you go with a stirrup hoe. If you don't know what that is, it's like it's something, it's a piece of metal that looks like that. It's connected to a pole, and you just kind of work it, and it slides under the roots, under the soil, and it cuts them. And it's pretty intense work. My kids complain profusely about having to do that, but it works really well for those roots that stick around. So maybe it's not the first thing you use, but on that third go, that's a perfect tool. So you might even hit it with a tiller and break out the big guns. And so when we try to extract value from language or experiences or people, there are layers, and there are more than 3, but that's just sort of an analogy to help you see how extracting the value of each subsequent layer requires a different effort, both in terms of your approach and the actual, like the force of the effort. It's very different. So, strategy and intensity are both different. So, if we just read this quote, and I butchered this, so hopefully one of you can sleuth out this quote in English. I don't have the citation because I didn't write this thinking that almost 20 years from putting this in this book, I'd be making some YouTube video. I'm not even sure if I knew about YouTube in 2007 or anyway, if it even existed, I don't remember. But there's enough here that first pass is probably plenty for you to work on. But maybe you're at the second pass level or the third pass level. And I want to use this as a specific example of an extremely valuable principle. And that principle is, every time you see God working, this is how it works. He put down the book. It's about to get serious. He's going to use his hands to talk. So basically, things are, right? And God sees that, and then he admits undifferentiated chaos into that. And that's a mouthful, but I want you to just think of a mixing bowl, which is finite. It's got, it's just the bowl. It doesn't extend out, and there's stuff in it. And that stuff has established connections among itself. It's all touching, right? Maybe it's been mixed up. Maybe it's been sitting. Who knows? Who cares? Into that, he adds new ingredients. These are ingredients that also may have been worked somewhere else. or maybe they're just kind of thrown together. And he adds that in. And that happens in a process that can vary, but we're just going to skip over that. And that new mixture has to be processed. Those things have to sort each other out. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about the creation of galaxies or solar systems or planets or people. This is how creation works, right? Not just creation as an event, but I'm talking about everything as a process. Everything is part of creation. It's God's work. This is the pattern. This is always how it works. There's something, it gets mixed with something new, and then in that process, it changes. So let's talk about those changes. In those changes, usually something comes out. So something new went in, it gets mixed up, and then something comes out. The thing that comes out is almost never exactly the new thing that went in. It's a piece of the old stuff, and maybe some of the new stuff. And I hope I'm not talking in too general of terms. I'm just giving you a picture. We can drill down, and I hope your mind is firing and the Spirit's working with you to apply this to all these things that you've experienced in your life. But there's an aggregation and a mixing and a change. And it's a real change. And then there's a sorting. Not a sorting like an assortment, but a space sorting. And in that sorting, something comes out. And what comes out? It's what doesn't deserve to stay in the bowl. The bowl's like your working copy, right? Your recipe. There are recipes where you do something to something, and then there's waste that's not what you're concerned with. Like if you're making cheese, there's whey, and you don't care about that. And you find some poor bodybuilder to give it to. And there are a lot of recipes like that. But where there's some byproduct. And that's not what you're after because you value something else more. So this is the process. And we could talk a lot more about that, but not today. So this quote is great. And there's tremendous value in it. And maybe for where you are, that's all that needs to be said. But it's a great example of how just a few words, in this case, present the next level of extraction of information. So if we read this through again, which would be easier to do in Spanish, but I'm not going to subject you to language you might not know, or even worse if you do know it, my pronunciation these days, because my tongue has turned into glue when I try to roll my R's at this point. So let me point out some things that are little sticky wickets. So going through this again, let's see. No person can obtain the gift of eternal life if they're not willing to sacrifice all things. Let's pause there. Now, if you were trying to weasel out of extremely valuable truth while claiming to believe that truth, how would you interpret? I'm just going to talk about interpreting. I'm not going to try to pretend to know Joseph F. Smith's motives in writing this or the translator's motives in thinking and translating it, because I don't even have the original English quote in front of me. But I'm just using this as an example. If you knew that you didn't do that, that you wouldn't give all things, and you're not giving all things, let's put it that way, and you want to avoid feeling guilty about that, while having whatever benefits, residual benefits you could from saying, yeah, I believe that because it rings true and I don't want to fight that because it rings true. How powerful would it be for you to hang on that word willing? So maybe this rings a bell if you're LDS or used to be, and you think about the sacrament prayers, willing to remember him. Well, sure, I'm willing. Anybody can weasel into that word. Anybody. you can weasel anything you want into that and say like, well, I killed my brother yesterday, but I'm willing to obey the commandments someday. I try. I do my best. It's not as far-fetched as it might seem. It's not as much of an exaggeration as you might think. And we can continue reading this. We can't achieve this while our desires are focused on the world. Here's another one where you might say, well, I mean, I try to be a good person. I desire good things. One of the craziest things about the gospel is this idea of sifting. And in this theme, in my deranged mind, I split the idea of sifting into, so Jesus says to Peter, careful because Satan desires to sift you as wheat. And we think sifting is therefore bad because it's something Satan does, right? Well, Satan does a lot of things that can be done for good, like teaching. He teaches people. So it's not about the what as much as the why and the how in a lot of things. Difference between good and evil. Motive is super important. Anyway, when it comes to sifting, turns out that what God does to you is not so different than what a farmer does to wheat when they are processing it. I've talked about this before. It's something I know very well. I've breathed in a lot of chaff, some from wheat, processing it by hand to see what that was like, and a lot more from rye because that happens to be a wonder crop where I live. But how you do this in a low-tech situation is you take all the raw product, the heads of the grain, and you put them on a hard surface, like a concrete driveway works great, but in a low-tech situation, you just need a flat rock that's as big as you can find, and hopefully it's high up. So you have to carry this stuff to the top of a hill because the wind is blasting there, right? If you haven't hiked up a hill in recent history, it's like the wind's always blowing up in the hills, right? Because they're exposed. So you hike this stuff up to a hill with a big flat rock, you dump it out. And the way you process this is you get yourself some oversized nunchucks and you beat the living daylights out of this stuff over and over and over again. It takes a really long time and you gotta wail on it. So once you do this for a while, then what you do is get yourself a fork, not like one you eat with, but a big old pitchfork looking thing, and you pitch this. That's why they're called pitchforks. You pick up a bunch and chuck it into the sky. And so what you're hoping for, which is, it doesn't happen as frequently as you'd like, which means it's a lot more work for you and throwing this stuff up over and over. You hope the wind blows as you throw it up. Because when the wind blows, all the chaff is lighter than the wheat or the rye. The little seeds, they fall down before the chaff. But to get them to float off, you have to beat them first because you have to expose the part of the grain that's valuable, that's edible. It's in a hull, it's surrounded by a very fibrous, what's the chaff? It's a covering that's waterproof, and you can't eat that, or else you're going to be friends with the toilet for a long time. So you want to get that off of the grain, and you have to beat it to open it and expose the valuable part. So hopefully some light bulbs are going off because there's a reason this is described so thoroughly in Scripture and why God designed it this way to teach us in a very visceral way, because it's kind of like your ability to eat depends on it. So grain's the staff of men. We lean on it in most times throughout history when we're not swimming in nearly free oil to survive. So this winnowing process is what it's called, where you separate the wheat from the chaff, or the rye from the chaff, as it may be. It's very important, and it's important not just for Satan, but for God. The process is different, in many ways, but also the same in others. So I like to think of this in terms of Satan sifting you and God sifting you, because it's kind of the same process, but the outcome, that's the desired outcome, is very different. God is trying to make you into wheat or rye, and Satan is trying to make you into chaff. He wants you to be blown away. Now, what does that mean? He wants you to be overcome. By what? Wind or fire, because the chaff is also burned. So what are these things? This could be a long discussion, but just one to attach one fruitful idea to each, and you can take it where you'd like. If you want to think about wind, you can read John 3, Jesus' description to Nicodemus about how the Spirit is wind. In the Hebrew word, it's the same word. The Spirit is like wind. And so if you think about that in terms of information, because the Spirit is a realm of ideas. And then with the fire, that's the consequences of reality. And consequences aren't negative. They're not good or bad. Both of those are in there. It's like the word risk. We always think of it in terms of bad things, but it's not bad. Risk is opportunity and danger. They're both in that bucket. And life is all about sorting the buckets, right? Good and evil. They're in the same bucket. You got to pull everything out and figure it out. And now we've come full circle, no pun intended, because we started talking about circles and coming full circle, to this idea of coming around again and knowing much more than what you knew before and seeing things differently. Anyway, going back to why we started talking about wheat and chaff in the first place, as you get to the higher level of trying to extract information, you see these words and you have to sort the chaff from the wheat, because Satan is going to use the chaff to distract you from what you need to subject yourself to become wheat. Because right now you're both. You're both, and Satan wants to push you over to the side of becoming full chaff, and God wants to push you to the side of becoming full wheat. These are the ways of death and life. We're on this planet to choose to go more of one way or the other. We're here living to go forward, and many people choose to go backwards. And that actually, forward and backwards aren't good words to use for that. You can go out of the way at any time, and you can come back into the way at any time. But it's not just going forward and backwards, because if you pop off, you do go back, and you have to restart, and it gets really complicated. But the way of life is a way of improvement from wherever you are to whatever is better. And the way of death is anything else. And so that's why the way of death is broad and easy to find, and most people are in it. But the way of life is narrow, and it's hard to find. And few there be that find it, and even fewer stay in it or go very far. So, in this quote, we talked about some examples of things that can derail people, and what it does is it takes the power of these words and waters it down and neuters it, so that the benefit that you might have from reading these things and understanding them goes out the window like chaff in the wind, because words are co-opted, phrases are presumed to be understood already, actions are weaseled out of, and so forth. And so so that's just a quote from a guy, but even when you're reading the scriptures, it's very possible and actually, unfortunately, super common that, sorry, I hit the camera, you can read something and totally not get what it says, even if it's said in the plainest possible way. And one of the most detrimental influences to this process is tradition. So another theme that comes up is this idea of the pros and cons of familiarity. And that's a theme you could apply to people. So prophet is not without honor except in his own country, among his own family. Because when you know someone well, you have many opportunities to take for granted the value that they could otherwise provide you, among other things, among other potential problems there. But there are strong pros of proximity, familiarity, because, for instance, you just can't get the same thing from someone at a distance as you can up front. And these don't have to be some sort of weird situations that, you know, whatever. And I've talked extensively, although honestly I can't remember which of the videos I published and which I deleted, because I didn't think it was the right time, even though I spent time recording them. Anyway, these ideas are always buzzing around in here about the need to bring people into your sphere of influence, like Abraham did. He had 318 people, according to Psalms, living in his house, and those were just the men who were of the age to go to war. So there were also old dudes and children and women. And some people say that maybe there were 2,000 people in their tents cruising around with Abraham as he wandered the promised land under his service. So technically describable as his servants, although he was the one serving them in a very interesting irony that's always the case in God's kingdom. So anyway, I had a place I was going with that, and I just totally lost my train of thought because I started thinking about Abraham. Right, so sphere of influence. It doesn't have to literally be in your house, but whatever good you can do in this world, that's your sphere of influence, your potential to reach out and help other people in whatever way that is, whatever that looks like. And it could just be giving a random person a true and sincere compliment when you're out in town. It might be helping someone at work. It might be picking up a piece of trash in the street. I mean, there's no limit. It's just improvement. It's raw improvement everywhere. And well, I'm looking at the clock and the length of this video, and I need to get back to writing. But I appreciate you watching this if you got this far, and I hope this smattering of thoughts is helpful to you. Cover a lot of ground, so hopefully at least one piece of spaghetti sticks to the wall. I'll talk to you some other time.